I'm 49 years old, and I've spent the last 4 decades believing I was forgotten. My name is Ethan Moore, and this is the story of how a $600 debt changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and the grandfather I barely remembered. Houston in August is like living inside someone's mouth. The heat doesn't just hit you, it swallows you whole, wraps around you like a wet blanket, and refuses to let go. I was sitting in my studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days, probably sometime in the 1970s, with the AC unit wheezing like it was on its last legs. The landlord kept promising to fix it, but that promise was as reliable as everything else in my life. I was surrounded by cardboard boxes, the kind you get from liquor stores because they're free and sturdy. My mother's belongings. She'd been gone 3 years now, but I'd kept putting off this final task. Some boxes you don't want to open because once you do, that person is really truly gone. As long as her stuff was sealed up in my storage unit, some part of me could pretend she was just away, maybe on a vacation she'd never taken in life. My mother, Sarah Moore, died of pancreatic cancer at 68. Quick and brutal, the way she would have wanted it if she'd had a choice. 6 weeks from diagnosis to death. No fuss, no drama. That was Mom. Even at the end, she kept apologizing for the inconvenience, for the medical bills, for taking up space in the hospice room. "I'm sorry, honey," she'd whispered in those final days. "I wish I could have given you more." She'd given me everything she had. It just wasn't much. Now I was sitting on the threadbare carpet that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, surrounded by shoeboxes full of photographs, old report cards with my childish handwriting, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. My life, and hers, reduced to paper memories in a room that smelled like dust and regret, and the Chinese takeout I'd eaten 2 days ago. That's when I found it. Tucked inside a small manila envelope, the kind you'd use for storing important documents, wrapped in so many layers of yellowing scotch tape that it looked like a mummy, was a brass key. It was small, ornate, with the kind of detailing that suggested age and importance. The kind of key that looks like it belongs in a mystery novel. Attached to it was a faded tag, the cardboard kind with a string through a hole, covered in spidery handwriting I didn't recognize at first. Deposit Box 112, More Trust. My heart did something strange in my chest. A little flip, like missing a step going downstairs in the dark. More Trust. My grandfather's name was Harold Moore. I sat there on that carpet, holding that key like it might disintegrate if I breathed wrong, and let myself remember the man I'd barely known. Harold Moore was a legend in my childhood, though I only met him a handful of times before he died. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with thick silver hair that he wore swept back from his forehead, and hands that were always stained with something. Ink, grease, oil, the residue of invention. He had these bright blue eyes that seemed to look right through you, like he could see the blueprint of your soul. He owned a manufacturing company, Moore Precision Industries, that made precision parts for the aerospace industry. Started it in a garage in 1952 with nothing but a lathe, $500 borrowed from his father-in-law, and a dream that probably seemed crazy at the time. By the time I was born in 1976, the company employed over 300 people and had contracts with NASA, Boeing, and half a dozen defense contractors. My mother used to tell me stories about growing up as Harold Moore's daughter, how he'd bring home prototypes and half-finished inventions and leave them all over the house, how her mother would find machine parts in the kitchen, drawings on every available surface. "Your grandfather," she'd say with this mixture of pride and exasperation, could never turn his brain off. He saw problems everywhere, and he couldn't rest until he'd solved them. I was 9 years old when he passed away in 1985. I remember the funeral, the crowd of mourners that seemed to stretch forever, the business associates in expensive suits who spoke about Harold like he was some kind of industrial saint, my Uncle Charles standing at the front of it all like he owned not just the grief, but the man himself. What I remember most clearly, though, was the day after the funeral. Uncle Charles, my mother's older brother, called us into the study of my grandfather's house. It was a dark paneled room that smelled like leather and old books and pipe tobacco, even though Grandpa Harold had quit smoking years before. The walls were lined with patents framed like artwork, and his massive oak desk dominated the space. Charles sat behind that desk like he'd already claimed it. My mother and I sat in the chairs across from him like supplicants at an audience with a king. "I've reviewed Harold's will with the attorneys," Charles said, his voice flat, not quite meeting my mother's eyes. "The company and all assets go to me. There's no provision for Sarah or the boy." I remember my mother's face going white, all the color draining out of it like someone had pulled a plug. "That's not possible. Dad would never—" "It's all legal and final," Charles interrupted, his voice getting harder. He finally looked at me, and something in his expression made me feel very small, very young, very much in the way. "You weren't mentioned, Ethan. Don't come around expecting money or handouts. Harold built this company with his own hands, and he wanted someone who could run it, someone with business sense to have it, not a widow and a child." My mother stood up so fast her chair fell backward with a crash that echoed in that book-lined room. "How dare you? You've always been jealous that Dad loved." "I'm just the messenger, Sarah. Don't shoot me for telling the truth. Harold made his choice. Maybe if you hadn't married that loser, if you'd stuck around instead of running off." "Get out," my mother said, her voice shaking. "We're leaving." "Take your time," Charles said with a smile that wasn't a smile. "Just don't come back expecting anything." We left that day and never went back. My mother never spoke to Charles again, never mentioned her brother's name without her jaw tightening. And me? I grew up believing I'd been forgotten by the one person everyone said was brilliant, visionary, unstoppable. The great Harold Moore had looked at his only grandson and decided he wasn't worth remembering. That rejection became the background noise of my life. It hummed beneath everything I did. Every failed business venture that seemed promising until it wasn't. Every job I quit. Because the boss was an idiot. Or the work was beneath me, or the commute was too long. Every relationship that fell apart because I couldn't commit, couldn't trust, couldn't believe that anyone would stay once they really knew me. I was the forgotten grandson, and some part of me had always believed I deserved to be. I'd tried over the years. God knows I'd tried. At 23, I'd started a landscaping business that went under when my partner stole our equipment and disappeared. At 28, I'd gotten a real estate license and worked for 6 months before the market crashed. At 35, I'd gone back to school for a degree I never finished. At 42, I'd worked as a manager at a sporting goods store until I got fired for telling the regional manager exactly what I thought of his inventory policies. Now, at 49, I was working at a warehouse, loading trucks and moving boxes. 49 years old with a high school diploma, an unfinished associate's degree, and $72 in my checking account. But now, 40 years later, I was holding a key that said maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been forgotten after all. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I'd never called in sick before, not in 3 months of working at the warehouse, and my supervisor sounded suspicious. "You sure you're sick, Moore? You sound fine to me." "Food poisoning," I lied. "Bad Chinese food?" "Whatever. Be back tomorrow, or don't bother coming back at all." I hung up and looked at the key sitting on my kitchen counter, catching the morning light. Today was September 3rd. My 50th birthday was in 5 months, February 12th, 2026. I wondered if that meant anything. The address on the tag led me to First Republic Bank, downtown on Travis Street. I took the bus because I couldn't afford the gas to drive my 15-year-old Honda Civic, and anyway, it needed an oil change I'd been putting off for 3 months. The key was in my pocket the whole ride, heavy as a stone, present as a heartbeat. The bus crawled through Houston traffic, past the gleaming towers of downtown, through neighborhoods that were being gentrified by developers who saw dollar signs where families used to see homes. I watched it all through the smudged window and thought about my grandfather, who'd built something in this city, something that lasted. First Republic Bank was a grand old building with marble columns that had somehow survived Houston's endless appetite for tearing down the old to make room for the new. It looked out of place among the glass and steel towers around it, like a grandmother at a nightclub. Inside, it was cool and quiet, with the kind of hush that makes you whisper automatically, like being in a library or a church. The floor was real marble, worn smooth by a century of footsteps. The teller windows were the old-fashioned kind, with brass bars and mahogany counters. The whole place smelled like money and history. I approached the nearest teller, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, with perfect makeup and a name tag that read Jessica. She had the professional smile of someone who'd been trained to be pleasant, but not too friendly. "Hi, I fumbled the key out of my pocket, suddenly aware of my discount store jeans and the 10-year-old sneakers I was wearing. "I have this key for a safe deposit box, number 112. Jessica took the key, turning it over in her manicured hands with the kind of careful attention that suggested this was unusual. She typed something into her computer, frowned, typed more, and then her expression shifted from professional politeness to genuine confusion. "Sir, this box, it hasn't been accessed since 1985. "That's possible," I said, my mouth dry. "My grandfather died that year." "Okay." More typing, the click of keys filling the silence. Then her face changed again, and I knew before she spoke that there was a problem. There was always a problem. "Oh, there's a problem." My stomach dropped in that familiar way. the way it had dropped 1,000 times before when the universe reminded me that I wasn't allowed to have nice things. The annual fee for the box is $15. According to our records, it hasn't been paid since 1985. That's... She paused, calculating, her lips moving slightly as she did the math. That's 40 years. With late fees and interest compounded annually, the total due is $612. I felt the heat rise to my face, that familiar flush of shame that had been my constant companion since childhood. $612. I had $72 in my checking account. $72 to last me until my next paycheck from the warehouse job, which was in 6 days if I still had a job after calling in sick. I couldn't even afford the fees to access whatever my grandfather had left me. I don't have that, I said quietly, looking down at my scuffed sneakers on that beautiful marble floor. Jessica looked genuinely sorry. I'm afraid we can't open the box until the fees are paid, sir. Company policy. I'm really sorry. I stood there, that key burning a hole in my palm, and felt something crack inside me. It was like a dam breaking. 40 years of believing I was forgotten, and now this. Proof that my grandfather had left me something, anything, and I couldn't even afford the $600 to find out what it was. The universe's final joke. Here's hope. Now watch as you can't afford it. Is everything all right here? The voice came from behind me, soft but authoritative. I turned to see a woman in her 50s, dressed in a sharp business suit that probably cost more than my rent, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her name tag identified her as Patricia Chen, branch manager. I'm sorry, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. I'll come back when I have the money. I just need to... I couldn't finish. Need to what? Rob a bank? Win the lottery? Get a second job? Wait. Patricia was looking at the computer screen over Jessica's shoulder, her eyes scanning the information there. Did you say your name was Moore? Ethan Moore? Yes, ma'am. Something changed in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or memory. Harold Moore's grandson. I nodded, confused about how she'd know that. Patricia smiled, but there was sadness in it, the kind of sadness that comes from remembering someone you lost. My father worked for Harold Moore for 20 years. Thomas Chen, he was a machinist in the fabrication department. I don't remember him, I admitted. I was pretty young when... You wouldn't, but I remember your grandfather. She turned to Jessica. What's the amount due? $612, Ms. Chen. Waive the fees. Jessica blinked. Ms. Chen, I don't have the authority to... I do. Waive them. Patricia looked back at me. In 1974, when the recession hit and the aerospace contracts dried up, Moore Precision was struggling. Most companies were doing layoffs. It was the only way to survive. My father had 4 kids at home. My mother was sick. We were barely making rent. He was terrified he'd lose his job. She paused, and I saw her eyes were wet. Harold Moore called a company meeting. He stood in front of everyone and said, We're family here, and families don't abandon each other when times are hard. Instead of layoffs, he took a second mortgage on his house to make payroll, kept everyone employed, reduced his own salary to almost nothing. He saved my father's life, saved my whole family. I didn't know that, I said. Your grandfather was a good man, Mr. Moore. He believed in taking care of people. She gestured toward the elevator. Come on, let's see what Harold left for you. The vault was below ground, accessed by an elevator that creaked ominously as it descended. The walls were burnished brass that had aged to a soft glow, and the floor was more marble. Patricia used her master key along with mine to open the small steel door marked 112. The box inside was larger than I expected, about the size of a shoebox made of brushed steel that had dulled with age. She pulled it out carefully and set it on the small table in the private viewing room, a windowless space about the size of a closet, with just the table, 2 chairs, and harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. Take your time, Patricia said softly, touching my shoulder briefly. I'll be outside if you need anything. Then she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed final somehow. For a long moment, it might have been 30 seconds or 30 minutes, I just stared at the box, Schrodinger's inheritance. As long as I didn't open it, it could be anything. It could be everything. It could be the validation I'd been looking for my entire life, proof that I mattered to someone, that I hadn't been forgotten. Or it could be nothing. A few old photographs, some worthless documents, the key to a car that no longer existed. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside was a small velvet pouch, dark blue and soft with age, the kind of pouch that feels expensive even without knowing what's in it. Beside it was a piece of paper in a protective plastic sleeve. It looked official, covered in ornate writing and elaborate seals, and beneath both, taking up most of the box, was a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, with words written across it in faded fountain pen ink in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, to my grandson on his 50th birthday. I picked up the velvet pouch first because it was the smallest, the least intimidating. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. I loosened the drawstring with trembling fingers and poured the contents onto the table. Gold coins spilled out, gleaming under the fluorescent lights like captured sunlight. They clinked against each other with a sound that was pure and clear, like bells. I counted them with trembling fingers, laying them out in rows of 10. 50 coins, each one stamped with the image of a springbok and the words Krugerrand 1980 and Feingold 1 OZ Fine Gold. I didn't know much about gold. I'd never had reason to, but I knew Krugerrands were pure gold, 1 troy ounce each. 50 of them had to be worth... what? I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and Googled gold price per ounce. $2,043. 50 ounces times $2,043. $150. $100,000 in gold, just sitting in a box for 40 years while I struggled. But that wasn't all. I picked up the paper in the plastic sleeve with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. It was a stock certificate, formal and official, with elaborate borders and calligraphy that looked like art. The header read, Apple Computer Inc., in flowing script. The date, December 12th, 1985, just weeks before my grandfather died. The number of shares, 1,000. I stared at it, read it again, and again. 1,000 shares of Apple computer stock purchased in 1985. My mind went blank. I couldn't process it. I pulled out my phone again, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, and Googled Apple stock price. Current price, $227.43 per share. 1,000 shares times 227s. My brain couldn't do the math at first. The numbers were too big, too impossible, too far removed from my reality of $72 bank accounts and discount store sneakers. $227,000. But wait, I was forgetting something. Stock splits. Apple had split its stock multiple times over the years. I knew that much from watching financial news during slow moments at work. I Googled frantically. Apple stock splits history. The results loaded, and I had to sit down hard in the chair, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. Since 1985, Apple had split 2-for-1 in 1987, 2000, and 2005, and 7-for-1 in 2014. I tried to do the math, but my brain wouldn't cooperate. I had to use the calculator app on my phone. 1,000 shares times 2 times 2 times 2 times 7. 56,000 shares. At $227.43 per share. The number appeared on my screen and the room spun. I gripped the edge of the table with both hands. $12,136,080. $12,736,000. Plus the $100,000 in gold. I was holding enough wealth to change my life, to change my children's lives if I ever had children, to change my entire family's future, wealth that had been sitting in a locked box while I worked minimum wage jobs and ate ramen and wondered why I'd been forgotten. The envelope. I needed to read the letter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely break the seal. The paper inside was thick, expensive, cream-colored, the kind my grandfather would have used for something important. The handwriting was the same careful script from the envelope, written with a fountain pen in deep blue ink that had faded slightly but was still perfectly legible. My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, you've reached your 50th birthday and I am long gone. I imagine you have questions. You've probably spent years believing I forgot you, that I cared more about the business than my own flesh and blood, that I loved your Uncle Charles more than I loved your mother, my precious daughter. I need you to know, nothing could be further from the truth. When I wrote my final will in November of 1985, I left the company to your Uncle Charles. This was not because he deserved it more than you, or because I loved him more than your mother. It was because I knew Charles's heart. I knew his ambition, his hunger, his desperate need to prove himself. I knew that if I divided my estate, if I left anything to Sarah or to you, he would spend the rest of his life fighting for more, and he would destroy our family in the process. So I gave him what he wanted, the company, the house, the cars, the visible wealth. Let him have it. Let him think he won. Let him believe he was the chosen one, the favorite, the one who mattered most. But you, Ethan, you are my true heir. Not to the business I built, but to something far more important, freedom. In this box, I've placed 50 Krugerrands, pure gold enough to weather any financial storm, and 1,000 shares of a little computer company I invested in just a month before I wrote this letter. A young man named Steve Jobs came to pitch me personally. He was intense, driven, maybe a little crazy, but I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of myself at that age. The kind of hunger that changes the world. The company might fail, most do. The personal computer might be a passing fad. But I have a feeling about this one, Ethan. I have a feeling that 30 or 40 years from now, when you open this box, those shares might be worth something. Consider this my bet on the future, your future. I've arranged for this box to open when you turn 50 because I wanted you to build your own life first. I wanted you to know who you are without my money, without my name casting a shadow over everything you do. I wanted you to struggle, yes, but not forever, just long enough to become a man who can handle wealth without it ruining him, the way it's ruined so many others. I've watched Charles over the years. I love him, he's my son, but I don't trust him with anything more than the business. He has the hunger to succeed, but not the wisdom to know when enough is enough. He'll grow the company, make it worth more than I ever could, but he'll never be happy. He'll always want more, always feel like it's not enough, always wonder why success tastes like ashes in his mouth. I don't want that for you. Don't spend your inheritance seeking revenge on Charles. Don't waste a single moment trying to prove something to him or anyone else. He got what he wanted, and it will never be enough. That's his prison, Ethan. Don't join him there. Instead, build something, not for money or glory or to prove me right about you, but because you have something to say to the world. That's what I did with more precision, and those were the happiest years of my life. Not when the company was successful, but when I was in that garage, just me and a lathe and a problem to solve. Find your problem to solve. I loved you from the moment you were born. You were 3 weeks old when Sarah first brought you to meet me, and you grabbed my finger with your tiny hand and held on so tight. I knew then that you had strength in you. I'm sorry I won't be there to see the man you've become, but I believe in you. I have always believed in you. Always, Grandpa Harold P.S. Don't tell Charles about this immediately. Let him sweat a little first. After 40 years of thinking he won, let him wonder. I think I earned that small petty pleasure, don't you? I sat in that small room in the basement of First Republic Bank and cried. Not quiet tears, but huge, ugly, gasping sobs that shook my whole body and echoed off the walls. 40 years of bitterness, of believing I wasn't good enough, of carrying the weight of being forgotten like a stone in my chest. It all came pouring out. My grandfather had seen me, had known me, had believed in me before I even had a chance to disappoint him. Patricia knocked softly after what might have been 5 minutes or 50. I'd lost all sense of time. Mr. Moore, are you all right? I wiped my face with my sleeve, trying to compose myself, but gave up. I opened the door. My grandfather didn't forget me, I said, my voice raw. Patricia smiled, and her eyes were wet too. I never thought he did. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not right away. I took the letter, the stock certificate, and the gold coins home in a secure bank bag that Patricia gave me, along with a business card for a securities lawyer who specialized in old stock certificates and estate issues. His name was Marcus Webb, and Patricia vouched for him personally. I rode the bus home, clutching that bag like it contained my heart, every bump and jostle sending a spike of anxiety through me. I was convinced someone would rob me, or I'd forget the bag on the bus, or I'd wake up and discover this was all an elaborate dream my desperate brain had conjured. For 3 days, I just sat in my apartment, rereading the letter until I had it memorized, holding the coins one by one and feeling their weight, looking at the stock certificate and trying to make it feel real. I called the warehouse and quit. My supervisor was predictably angry. I knew you were faking sick, Moore. Good luck finding another job with no reference from me. I'll manage, I said, and hung up. On the 4th day, I called Marcus Webb. His office was downtown, a sleek modern space with glass walls and minimalist furniture that made my discount store clothes feel even shabbier. But Marcus himself was surprisingly down-to-earth, mid-50s, slightly rumpled suit, with the kind of face that suggested he smiled often. Mr. Moore, he said, shaking my hand firmly. Patricia told me you might have something interesting. She didn't say what, just that I should clear my schedule. I showed him the stock certificate. His eyebrows rose. Well, this is definitely interesting. May I? He pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the certificate carefully, checking the paper, the seal, the signatures. After several minutes, he looked up at me. This is legitimate, or at least it certainly appears to be. Apple maintained meticulous records of all physical certificates, even after they transitioned to electronic record-keeping. We'll need to verify this with their transfer agent, but assuming it checks out, and I have no reason to think it won't. You're looking at a substantial sum. How substantial? He did some quick calculations on his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Factoring in all the stock splits since 1985, current market price, approximately $12.7 million. Hearing someone else say it, hearing it spoken out loud by a professional in an office with law degrees on the wall, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Mr. Moore, you still with me? I realized I'd been staring into space. Yeah, sorry, it's just a lot. I imagine so. He leaned back in his chair. Here's what you need to know. First, the good news. This type of inheritance typically receives what's called a stepped-up basis. That means you won't owe capital gains tax on the appreciation that occurred before you inherited it. You'll only owe tax on gains after the inheritance date, which for estate purposes was when your grandfather died, not when you opened the box. That's good. Very good. It potentially saves you millions in taxes. The complicated news is that verifying and transferring a 40-year-old physical stock certificate will take time. We need to contact Apple's transfer agent, provide proof of your identity and inheritance rights, verify the certificate's authenticity, and navigate a lot of paperwork. The process typically takes 3 to 6 months. That's okay, I said. The words surprised me with how true they were. I've waited 40 years. I can wait a little longer. Good attitude. He smiled. In the meantime, those Krugerrands, those you can liquidate immediately if you need cash. Gold coins are essentially currency. Any reputable gold dealer will buy them. I sold 10 of the coins the next day. At current gold prices, with the dealer taking a small commission, that gave me $19,800, more money than I'd ever had in my bank account at once. I paid off my credit cards, $4,200 in debt, that had been hanging over me for years. I paid 3 months of rent in advance, $2,700, which made my landlord so happy he agreed to fix the AC. I took my car to a real mechanic and had everything fixed that needed fixing, $1,800. I bought new clothes that actually fit and didn't come from Walmart, $800. I bought a new laptop to replace the 10-year-old one that barely worked, $1,200, and I put the rest, $9,100, into a savings account, my first real savings account since I was in my 20s. But I didn't quit working. I found a new job, a better one, managing inventory at a medical supply company. Better hours, better pay, actual benefits. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what came next. My grandfather's letter kept echoing in my mind. Build something. But what? What did I have to say to the world? What problem could I solve? I found myself driving around Houston in my newly reliable car, aimless, thinking. One afternoon in late September, I ended up in the old industrial district east of downtown, where my grandfather's original factory had been. I hadn't been back here since I was a kid. The neighborhood had declined over the decades, the kind of decline that happens when industries move and jobs disappear. Most of the buildings were abandoned now, tagged with graffiti, windows broken and boarded up. But some were being renovated, bought by developers who saw potential in the high ceilings and solid construction. I remembered my grandfather bringing me here once when I was maybe 7 years old, before he got sick. It was a Saturday, and he'd picked me up in his big Cadillac and driven me through the city. Want to see where the magic happens? He'd asked, and I'd nodded enthusiastically. He'd held my hand and walked me through the factory floor. I'd needed earplugs because of the noise. The machines humming and clanking, metal screaming against metal, the smell of oil and hot steel in the air. Workers in safety glasses and gloves had called out greetings to him, and he'd known all their names. This is where dreams become real, Ethan, he'd said, squatting down to my level. You see these machines? Each one takes an idea, just air and imagination, and turns it into something people can touch, something that helps them do their work. That's the real magic. Not making money, but making things that matter. I'd been too young to really understand, but I'd never forgotten the pride in his voice. Now I parked my car and walked until I found it. 2847 Harrisburg Boulevard. A low brick building, maybe 10,000 square feet, with broken windows and a faded for sale sign that looked like it had been there for years. The paint was peeling, and someone had tagged one wall with elaborate graffiti, but the bones were good, solid construction from an era when buildings were meant to last. This was where Harold Moore had started his empire. This was where the magic happened. I called the number on the sign. Hello? The voice was older, gravelly, suspicious. Hi, I'm calling about the property at 2847 Harrisburg. What about it? Is it still for sale? Has been for 6 years. You interested? Maybe. Can I see it? His name was Albert Simmons, and he met me there an hour later. He was in his 70s, with weathered skin and suspenders holding up his pants. He opened the gate with a key he kept on a ring with about 50 others. Used to be a manufacturing plant, he said as we walked through the empty shell. Then a furniture warehouse. Then a church, if you can believe it. Been empty since 2018. The interior was gutted, but the structure was sound. High ceilings with exposed beams, old skylights that let in filtered light, concrete floors worn smooth by decades of use. I could almost hear the ghost of machinery, see my grandfather walking these same floors. "How much?" I asked. "I'm asking $200,000. But for the right buyer, cash offer, I'd take $180,000. It was probably worth less, given the condition and location, but I didn't try to negotiate. "I'll give you $180,000, cash. I need 1 week to arrange the transfer." Albert looked at me like I was crazy. "You serious?" "Dead serious." We shook on it. The purchase made the local news. Forgotten factory finds new owner. A small article on page 8 of the business section. But I didn't give any interviews. I wasn't ready yet. I spent the next 2 months working with contractors, architects, and designers I hired with money from selling more gold coins. We gutted the interior, cleaned it up, but kept the bones of the old factory intact. The exposed brick walls, the high ceilings with their original beams, the wide plank wooden floors under the concrete. I had a vision now. I knew what I wanted to build. I wanted to create a place where people could make things, where dreams could become real, where the magic my grandfather had shown me could happen again. On January 15th, 2026, exactly 40 years, and 1 month after my grandfather died, I opened the Moore Innovation Center. It wasn't a business, not exactly. It was a community workshop and makerspace, with tools and equipment for inventors, veterans, artists, students, anyone who wanted to build something but didn't have the resources. I charged a nominal membership fee, $20 a month, just enough to keep people invested, but not enough to exclude anyone who was serious. We had 3D printers, 6 of them from basic to professional grade, laser cutters for wood, acrylic, and fabric, welding equipment, MIG, TIG, and stick welders, woodworking tools, table saws, routers, planers, drill presses, electronics benches with oscilloscopes and soldering stations, and a small machine shop with a mill and lathe that would have made my grandfather proud. Not the exact models he'd used, but the same spirit. I hired 3 full-time staff. Maria, a retired aerospace engineer in her 70s who'd worked for NASA and had more knowledge in her little finger than I had in my entire body. Jake, a 24-year-old with a degree in industrial design from a state school and no job prospects because every entry-level position wanted 3 years of experience. And David, a Marine Corps veteran who'd done metalwork in the Corps and was struggling to find his place in civilian life. We opened on a Wednesday with no fanfare, no grand opening, just a sign on the door that said, "Moore Innovation Center, open to the public, come make something." The first week, 12 people signed up. Most were retired engineers and hobbyists who'd been working in their garages and were excited to have access to better equipment. The second week, 30 more joined. Word was spreading through maker forums and veterans organizations. By the end of the first month, we had 85 members and a waiting list. People were building everything. A retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson was using the laser cutter to create intricate wooden puzzles for her grandkids and selling them on Etsy. A group of engineering students was prototyping a solar-powered water filtration system for their senior project. 2 veterans, David and his buddy Marcus, started designing custom furniture using techniques they'd learned in the military, adapting them for civilian use. A 16-year-old girl named Alicia, whose family had come from Honduras, spent every afternoon after school working on a project. She was designing a low-cost hurricane shutter system using recycled materials, something her parents' neighbors could actually afford. After 3 months, she had a working prototype, launched a Kickstarter campaign, and raised $45,000. A local manufacturer offered to produce them. The building buzzed with creativity and the sound of making, the whir of 3D printers, the hiss of welders, the rhythmic thump of the laser cutter, people calling out questions and sharing solutions. I was there every day, not as the boss, but as a member. I took a welding class from David, learning to lay a bead that didn't look like a bird had made it. I learned CAD software from Jake, fumbling through tutorials. I helped Mrs. Patterson troubleshoot her puzzle designs. I stayed late with Alicia, helping her run calculations and test prototypes. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Local media started covering us. Small stories at first in neighborhood blogs, then bigger ones. Innovation Center brings new life to historic building. Where Houston makes inside the Moore Innovation Center. A local TV station did a segment on us for their community feature show. That's when Charles found out. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late March. I was at the center, helping a high school student troubleshoot the electronics for his science fair project, a device that detected toxic chemicals in water, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Ethan Moore speaking. "Ethan, it's your uncle, Charles." I hadn't heard his voice in 40 years, but I recognized it immediately. Smooth, authoritative, cultured. The voice of a man used to being obeyed, used to getting his way. "Charles," I said neutrally. The high school student looked at me curiously. "I saw the news story about your little project, the Innovation Center." He pronounced it like it was something vaguely distasteful, like I'd opened a pawn shop or a strip club. "Interesting endeavor. I'm curious how you're funding it. Last I heard from Sarah, before she passed, may she rest in peace, you were working in a warehouse." "Things change." "Indeed they do." A pause, loaded with meaning. "I'd like to meet with you. There are some family matters we should discuss. I think it's time we cleared the air after all these years." "I don't think we have anything to discuss." "I think we do." His tone got harder. "How about lunch tomorrow? Brennan's on Smith Street? My treat. Let's say noon?" Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. This was Charles issuing a summons, expecting compliance. "Fine. Noon." "Excellent. I look forward to catching up." He hung up before I could change my mind. Brennan's was the kind of restaurant where Houston's power elite went to make deals and be seen. White tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, waiters in formal attire, the kind of place where the wine list required a PhD to navigate and the menu had no prices. If you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. I showed up at noon wearing my best jeans, dark, no holes, and a button-down shirt I'd bought at Target. I still looked underdressed compared to the business suits and designer clothes around me, but I'd stopped caring what people thought. Charles was already there, seated at a corner table with a good view of the room. He stood as I approached, and I was struck by how he'd aged. He was 77 now, with silver hair immaculately styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. But there were lines around his eyes, a tightness to his mouth, a brittleness that suggested all the success in the world hadn't made him happy. "Ethan," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but brief, like he didn't want to touch me longer than necessary. "You look well, healthy." "Thanks." We sat. A waiter appeared instantly, as if summoned by telepathy, with menus that were leather-bound and heavy. Charles ordered wine without consulting me, something expensive from France, and we made small talk while we looked at the menus. The weather, Houston traffic, nothing real. After we ordered, I got the cheapest thing on the menu, a chicken dish, while Charles ordered some kind of fish flown in from Scotland. He leaned back and studied me. "So," he said, "the Innovation Center. Interesting project. Very philanthropic. It's been rewarding. I'm sure." He sipped his wine. "The building alone must have cost quite a bit. I looked it up. You paid $180,000 for that property. Then renovations, equipment. I'd estimate you've put at least $500,000 into this project. About that. I'm curious where you found the capital. Not from your warehouse salary, I imagine." He smiled, but it was the smile of a shark. "Did you take out loans, find investors, win the lottery?" I met his eyes. "I had some savings." He laughed, sharp and bitter. "Ethan, let's not play games. You're 50 years old. Happy birthday, by the way. Was it last month? And until 6 months ago, you were working manual labor. Now suddenly you own a building and you're running a charity workshop. Where did the money come from?" "Why does it matter?" "Because I'm your uncle, and I'm concerned." His voice took on a false note of care. "If you've borrowed money from loan sharks, or if you're in over your head financially, I want to help. That's what family does. I'm not in over my head. Then where did the money come from?" His voice got harder, the false concern dropping away. "Did Sarah leave you something? Some insurance policy I didn't know about?" "No, Mom died with about $8,000 in savings. That barely covered her funeral." "Then what?" I took a sip of water, taking my time, watching him get more agitated. "My grandfather left it to me." The color drained from Charles's face. "That's impossible. I was the sole beneficiary of Harold's estate. I have the will, the probate records, everything. Of his company and property, yes. His visible assets. There was nothing else. There was a safe deposit box." I watched the realization hit him, watched his face go from confusion to understanding to something darker. "What safe deposit box?" "Box 112 at First Republic Bank. Grandfather put it in trust for me, to be opened when I turned 50. Inside were some gold coins and a stock certificate." His jaw tightened. "What stock certificate?" "Apple Computer, 1,000 shares, purchased December 1985. I watched him do the math in his head, the same math I'd done, watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. "How much stock?" His voice was barely a whisper. "After the splits? About 56,000 shares. Current value around 12.7 million. For a long moment, he just sat there, perfectly still, his face frozen in an expression I couldn't read. Then he laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made the people at nearby tables look over. The old bastard. He planned this whole thing. His hands were shaking slightly. He let me think I'd won. He let me run the company, build it into something worth $500 million, thinking I was the chosen one. And all along, he gave you... He couldn't finish. He gave me freedom, I said quietly. Not the company, not the burden of running it, just freedom to choose who I want to be. Freedom? Charles's voice rose. You think that was a gift? He gave me responsibility, expectations, pressure. Every decision I made, I had to wonder what Harold would have done. Every success felt hollow because I was standing in his shadow. And you? He pointed at me, his finger shaking. You got to live your life however you wanted, no pressure, and then get handed millions at the end? I spent 40 years thinking I was forgotten. And I spent 40 years trying to prove I was worthy. He was almost shouting now, and people were definitely staring. Do you know what it's like to run a company you inherited? To know that everything you achieve, people attribute to your father? To never be able to step out of that shadow? Then why did you keep doing it? The question stopped him cold. You could have sold the company, I continued. Could have done something else with your life. But you didn't. You kept running it, kept growing it. Not because grandfather forced you to, but because you wanted to. Because it was never enough. Charles stood abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. Keep your blood money, Ethan. Build your little charity workshop. Play the benevolent grandson bringing back Harold's legacy. But don't expect me to celebrate it. His voice was icy now. Harold built a real company, something that employed hundreds of people and generated billions in economic value. You're just playing with his legacy, pretending you understand what he built. He threw down several $100 bills, far more than lunch cost, and walked out. I sat there for a moment, then picked up my fork and finished my meal. It was excellent. As I ate, I pulled out my phone and reread my grandfather's letter, the part I'd memorized. Don't spend your inheritance seeking revenge on Charles. He got what he wanted, and it will never be enough. That's his prison. Don't join him there. My grandfather had known. 40 years ago, he'd known exactly how this would play out. By August 2026, the Moore Innovation Center had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. We had 340 active members and had expanded into the building next door, another abandoned factory space that I'd purchased and renovated. We'd launched a full scholarship program for veterans and low-income students, covering their membership fees and providing stipends for materials. We'd partnered with 3 local high schools for their STEM programs, bringing in entire classes for hands-on workshops. In May, we'd hosted our first annual Maker Fair, a weekend-long celebration of creativity and building. Over 2,500 people attended, filling our space and spilling out into the parking lot. Members showed off their projects, gave demonstrations, taught workshops. Local food trucks set up outside. A local brewery donated beer for the adults. Kids ran around with 3D printed toys and laser-cut wooden swords. It was chaos and magic, exactly what my grandfather would have loved. 3 of our members had launched successful Kickstarter campaigns for products they'd prototyped at the center. Alicia's hurricane shutter system was now being manufactured by a local company and had been deployed in a dozen neighborhoods. Mrs. Patterson's puzzles were selling so well she'd quit her retirement job at Target. David and Marcus's furniture company had more orders than they could handle and were hiring other veterans. The local news covered the Maker Fair, and then the story got picked up by a national tech blog, and suddenly we were getting calls from people across the country wanting to know how to start similar spaces in their communities. I was sitting in my small office one afternoon, really just a desk in the corner of the main floor, when Maria knocked on the door frame. "You have a visitor?" she said, smiling mysteriously. Patricia Chen walked in, looking around at the busy space with wide eyes. "Patricia!" I stood and hugged her. "What brings you by?" "Curiosity," she said. "I've been reading about this place, seeing the news stories. My father won't stop talking about it. He came to the Maker Fair and spent 4 hours here. I thought I should see it for myself." I gave her the full tour. Both buildings now, over 20,000 square feet of creative space. The expanded machine shop with equipment I'd bought when the Apple stock finally transferred. The electronics lab with industry-grade tools. The wood shop that smelled like fresh-cut pine. The welding bay where David was teaching a class to a group of teenagers. The classroom space where Jake was showing someone how to use CAD software. The art studio where people were painting and sculpting. Patricia took it all in quietly, occasionally asking questions, watching the members work with their projects. When we finished, she had tears in her eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, concerned. "Nothing's wrong. She wiped her eyes, smiling. It's just, Harold would be so proud of you. This is exactly what he believed in, giving people the tools to build their own dreams, not doing it for them, but making it possible. I wish I'd known him better, I said, not for the first time. I have so many questions about him, about his life, about what he was thinking. He talked about you sometimes, you know. Patricia pulled out a chair at one of the workbenches, and I sat beside her. When he'd come into the bank, this was probably around 1984, maybe early 85, he'd chat with my father, who did the manufacturing company's business banking. He'd ask about you, how you were doing in school, what you liked to do. He was so proud that you loved to take things apart and figure out how they worked. I did love that, I admitted. I took apart my mom's toaster when I was 8. Never did get it back together right. Harold told my father, that boy has the mind of an engineer. He just needs time to figure out what to do with it. She looked around at the center. I think you figured it out. We sat in comfortable silence, watching a woman use the laser cutter to create an intricate design, watching two men collaborate on a welding project, watching the magic happen. Why didn't he fight Charles? I asked. Why did he just let him take everything? Patricia thought for a moment. My father used to say that Harold understood people better than anyone he'd ever met. He knew Charles needed to win, needed to prove himself, needed to be the successful son, and he knew that if he'd divided things up or shown favoritism, it would have destroyed the family. So he made a choice. Let Charles have the visible victory and give you something more valuable when you were ready for it. Freedom. Freedom, she agreed. The freedom to fail, to find yourself, to become who you're supposed to be without the weight of expectations. She stood. I should go, but thank you for showing me this. It gives me hope. For what? That good things can come from patience, that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, matters in the end. After she left, I sat at my desk and pulled out my grandfather's letter, now laminated and kept in my desk drawer. I read it for the 1,000th time, and for the first time, I understood something I'd missed before. My grandfather hadn't just left me money. He'd left me a path, one that took 40 years to walk, but led exactly where I needed to be. A year after opening the center, I was invited to speak at the National Manufacturing Summit in Austin. The topic was Revitalizing American Manufacturing Through Community Innovation. I almost declined. Public speaking terrified me. I'd never been good at it. And imposter syndrome was real. Who was I to talk about manufacturing or innovation? I was just a guy who got lucky with an inheritance. But Maria pushed me. You have a story people need to hear, she said. Stop hiding. So I accepted. Standing on that stage in front of 500 industry professionals, looking out at all those faces, I felt like I might throw up. But then I remembered my grandfather, standing on a factory floor at 22 years old with nothing but a dream and a lathe and the courage to start. I told my story, the forgotten grandson, the locked safe deposit box, the letter from a man who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, the choice to build something that mattered. My grandfather didn't just leave me money, I said, my voice getting stronger. He left me a question. What will you build? Not to make money, not to prove something to anyone else, but because you have something to say to the world. The Moore Innovation Center isn't about me. It's not about my grandfather's legacy or my family's story. It's about everyone who's ever had an idea but not the resources. It's about the high school student who wants to learn to weld, the veteran who needs a purpose after service, the retired engineer who still has knowledge to share, the single mother who wants to start a business but can't afford equipment. It's about rebuilding communities by remembering that we're a nation of makers. We don't just consume, we create. We solve problems by building things, by putting our hands to work, by taking ideas and turning them into reality. American manufacturing didn't die. We just forgot how to dream small enough to start and big enough to matter. The standing ovation surprised me, but what really mattered were the conversations afterward. Dozens of people who wanted to start similar spaces in their communities, companies interested in partnering with us and replicating our model, educators wanting to bring their students to learn. 3 months later, we launched the Moore Innovation Network, a nonprofit organization helping other communities start their own makerspaces. Within 6 months, 12 new centers had opened in cities across Texas. Within a year, there were 34 across the country. The ripples were spreading, exactly the way my grandfather's impact had spread decades ago. One person at a time, one community at a time. Charles never reached out again. I saw in the news that he'd sold Moore Precision Industries for $520 million to a private equity firm. He was quoted in the article as saying, "After 40 years, it's time for the next generation to take the helm." I wondered if he was happy. I wondered if $520 million was finally enough. I hoped so. I genuinely did. On my 50th birthday, February 12th, 2026, exactly as my grandfather had planned, I went back to First Republic Bank. Patricia met me in the lobby with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What's this?" I asked, confused. "One more thing from Harold." Her eyes were twinkling. "He left instructions that if you successfully claimed the first box, we were to give you this on your actual birthday. He was very specific about the timing." My hands shook as I unwrapped it. Inside was another envelope, thicker than the first, and a small brass compass that looked old and well-used, its face slightly scratched, its needle still pointing true north. The letter was written on the same cream-colored paper as the first. "Ethan, happy 50th birthday, my boy. Half a century old. Can you believe it? I certainly couldn't imagine it when I was your age." Time moves so strangely. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday I was starting out, and sometimes it feels like I've lived 3 lifetimes. If you're reading this, you've opened the box and done something with what I left you. I don't know what. That was for you to decide. But knowing you inherited your grandmother's kind heart and your mother's fierce spirit, and maybe a little bit of my stubborn determination, I trust it was something good. This compass belonged to my father, Samuel Moore. He gave it to me in 1952 when I told him I was quitting my job at the factory to start my own company. He thought I was crazy, leaving a good job with benefits to work in a garage. But he gave me this compass and told me something I've never forgotten. "It doesn't matter which direction you choose, son, as long as you pick one and keep going. The world is full of people who never start because they're afraid of choosing wrong. The secret is that there is no wrong, just different paths to different places. Pick a direction and walk." So I did, and it wasn't always the right direction. I made mistakes. I failed more times than I can count. I nearly went bankrupt twice, lost my house once, worked 18-hour days for years. But I kept walking, kept adjusting course, kept moving forward. Now it's your turn to walk your own path. This compass doesn't tell you where to go. You figured that out on your own by now. It's just a reminder that the journey matters more than the destination, that it's okay to change direction, that getting lost sometimes is part of finding yourself. I'm proud of you, Ethan. I was always proud of you, from the moment you grabbed my finger with your tiny baby hand and held on like you'd never let go. You had strength even then. You just needed time to find it. I wish I could have known you as a man. I wish I could have seen what you built, heard your stories, offered advice you probably wouldn't have needed. But life doesn't always give us what we wish for. It gives us what we need, and sometimes what we need is to find our own way. Be kind. Build things that matter. Don't let success define you any more than you let failure defeat you. And remember that being forgotten isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. Forgetting who you are is worse. I loved you. I love you. I always will. Your proud grandfather, Harold Moore, P.S. I hope Charles found peace. I truly do. I didn't do what I did to punish him, but to protect all of you. Family is complicated, isn't it? We hurt the ones we love even when we're trying not to. If you ever see him again, tell him I was proud of him too. I just showed it differently. I stood in the lobby of First Republic Bank, holding that compass and that letter, and I wasn't crying this time. I was smiling. Patricia touched my shoulder. "You okay?" "I'm perfect," I said, and I meant it. That evening, I stood on the roof of the Moore Innovation Center, watching the sun set over Houston. The building hummed with activity below, people building, learning, creating, finding their own paths. The compass sat in my pocket, solid and real, its needle steady and true. Somewhere, I like to think, my grandfather was smiling. I hadn't inherited a company worth $520 million. I hadn't inherited wealth that would last generations or make headlines or change history. I'd inherited something better. Permission to build my own legacy in my own way, on my own terms. The freedom to fail and the freedom to try again. The understanding that success isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch. The dreams you help bring to life. The difference you make in the small corner of the world where you choose to stand. And that, it turned out, was worth more than all the money in the world. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the sunset. Golden light spilling across the city, painting everything in shades of hope and promise. I posted it to the Innovation Center's social media with a simple caption, 50 years old today, exactly where I'm supposed to be. The compass in my pocket seemed to grow warmer, or maybe that was just my imagination. But real or imagined, it felt like confirmation, like my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, like his voice in my ear saying what I needed to hear. You picked a direction, you kept walking, and look where you've arrived. Below me, I heard laughter. Someone had solved a problem, figured out a puzzle, made something work. The sound of victory, small and perfect and complete. I smiled and headed back downstairs. There was work to do, people to help, dreams to build, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged.